Most of my patients, they'll hear about testosterone therapy and that sparks their interest. And sometimes they're like, my buddy's on and he looks amazing and he feels great. And they don't always come to me with some outward problem. Oftentimes they're like, I think I feel pretty good. And then as I start digging, the motivation, the lack of drive comes out. Oh yeah, I'm not feeling like I used to. I want to get up and go to work and even get to the gym. That's hard. And the effort I do put in at the gym, it's just not showing, and that's exhausting. And so those are the big ones. It's really the motivation piece. And they don't always know that testosterone is the answer, but more and more men are realizing that drive is important and it should be there, and it's not. Every once in a while, you'll have the sexual health function, but it's not as often in testosterone. That's what guys think about. They're like, oh, well, my erections are fine, so I must be fine. That can be a factor and can be a side effect, but it's not always the main player in the game. Weight gain and physical recovery and the results that they're getting at the gym are the biggest drivers.
Welcome back to the Smart Nutrition Made Simple show. I'm your host, as always, Ben Brown, head coach and owner here at Body Systems. I'm looking forward to today's conversation where I sit down with Dr. Jessica Foles. Dr. Jess is a naturopathic doctor, a hormone and peptide therapy specialist, and she's the founder of Rugged Gent Life. Now, Dr. Jess has built a thriving concierge practice here in Arizona where she helps men and women step into their full potential through hormone optimization, by leveraging peptide therapy, and focusing on lifestyle and longevity. But what really stood out to me with our conversation here and why I wanted to bring her on after getting to know her a little bit better was her mission to create what she calls hard to kill parents. Her work, as you're going to see, is deeply personal, from her own personal struggles with eating disorders to losing her father to alcohol and cancer. She's witnessed firsthand what happens when we neglect our health. And for her, that pain became her purpose. And today she's on a mission to help men reclaim their vitality, their resilience, and their presence, not just for themselves, but for their families and communities who count on them. In this conversation, we dig into the truth about testosterone therapy, why so many men are being gaslit by the conventional medical system, the real role of peptide therapy and in recovery and fat loss, and the lifestyle changes that make the biggest impact on how you look, how you feel, and how you lead as a man in your 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. So if you're a dad, if you're a husband, if you're a father, if you're simply someone who refuses to settle for normal aging, then this episode will challenge the way that you think about your body, your health, and your future. Let's dive in. Dr. Jess, welcome to the Smart Nutrition Made Simple show.
Ben,
How you doing?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. I'm excited for the opportunity to chat with you. So you're in an interesting space because you're a naturopathic doctor and functional medicine practitioner and health coach. And you talk about in your bio about creating hard to kill parents.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I guess a little bit of the backstory. So, I had my own journey with an eating disorder and stuff, and that's kind of how I got started into the fitness and nutrition piece. And, then I became a doctor and I was working for a really busy practice and working under someone else's terms and hours, and I was just run thin. And I had the opportunity to open my own space. And I realized that I needed to do that for the freedom and for my own sanity. I was really feeling like a loose cannon. So it was like kind of discovering like what it feels like to feel volatile and to feel like I wasn't resilient and I could just succumb to the weight of stress and the world around me. So that was a big part of that approach to parents, and really working with moms and dads and helping them be strong for the people that they love, because I was a young mom at the time too, a new mom. The other piece to that was losing my father right before COVID. He was a lifelong alcoholic, used drugs as well, and eventually developed cancer. And it was honestly the first time when he stopped drinking, when he had cancer, and it was like the first sober conversations I had had with him in decades. And I saw this really humble, just a humble kind of, like I watched him discover his mortality, and I could kind of see just the fear in his eyes. And, I never asked him or got the chance to say like, what would you do differently? But I could see kind of his life playing before his eyes. The last couple times that I saw him, he was just, and it was heartbreaking. And there's so much he could have done, instead of just writing off and just feeling like that he was immortal, and
Hmm.
that, the drug abuse and the risky behaviors and all that would just never catch up to him. And, in terms of men, I think men are put on this earth to build and to create and to have purpose and leave a legacy, and one especially that they're proud of. And I know he was proud of me and my accomplishments, but I don't think he was proud of himself. And I know there was a lot of resentment in me. He would share things with me when he was drunk, So I want so much more for men, and they're an integral part of our society, of families, of communities, the way they impact their spouses, their children. It's a big deal to me. And so, yeah, it's just about being vital, being around and being strong for those people that we love, whether they're
Yeah.
children, whether they're, husbands, wives.
Well, that's beautiful. I appreciate
Thank
the
you.
depth of sharing there. And it's so interesting because so much of what you said is a reflection of how I feel about my practice and why I do what I do. And I think so much of, and a lot of us health practitioners, if you will, is we get into the space by virtue of having to figure out our own stuff.
Yeah.
We all have experiences and issues that we're going through oftentimes when we're younger that we have to figure out how to remedy for ourselves. And by virtue of doing that, we develop a skill set that we realize is going to be very valuable to others. And naturally, we're type of people who want to be able to help other people as well as help ourselves. And then there's this other component that I heard you share, that's sort of like we do what we do to impact those that we love the most in a very roundabout way. And, it's sort of this overt, like, I want to be able to have the tools to help those people and of course, help as many other people in the process.
Yeah.
And I feel the exact same way about my parents, whether we have those conversations or not, which typically we don't,
Yeah.
to know that I'm going to live my life and be able to impact people like my parents in the most positive way possible. And like you said, ultimately build them up to become resilient
Yeah.
and hard to kill. So
Yeah.
massive respect for what you're doing.
Thank you.
Just a quick step back. What was it about when you were in that busy medical practice? I guess, first and foremost, what made you just briefly want to get into medicine in the first place?
Yeah. So I mentioned, the eating disorder as an adolescent. I was a chubby kid. I was an athlete, but I was definitely overweight. I was about 200 pounds going into high school. I definitely had some eating issues even as a child. Like I can remember just, like being at my dad's and like eating 3 or 4 king size Snicker bars like in a row out
Mm,
of, from like a Sam's Club thing, So like there was always things like that, but I could also eat 8 servings of green beans. So I always had that kind of addictive and never feeling full kind of an issue with food. Like if it tasted good, I wanted more. That obviously led me to being overweight, even despite being super athletic and playing a lot of sports. And I remember being a freshman in high school, and I was just like, I'm done being heavy. And I was over it. And I had a boyfriend, and I think that kind of inspired me. Like, well, I felt confident, that maybe I can do something about this. And so I started dieting, and it started off with just portion control. And then it just spiraled into like fat was bad, and so I stopped eating fat and I stopped eating
sure.
carbs, and I was living on like turkey and mustard roll-ups and apples, and meanwhile I was playing varsity softball and club ball. And I was exhausting my body, and I was extremely malnutrition to the point where eventually I got thin. And I remember getting to a point where I was like 118 pounds. I didn't own a scale, but my grandma did. I remember going to her house, and I'm like, oh, I feel really good here. And I just didn't know how to sustain it at that point. I was so far deep into, and it had messed with my brain so much that I didn't know how to eat any longer. And so I just continued to lose. And I became, at one point I was below 100 pounds. My junior year of high school, I started like swelling. I had like such, low protein counts that like my legs, and I had like a lot of edema and stuff in my ankles, and took me to a doctor and, my pediatrician. And they're like, they tried to coach me on nutrition and all of that. Obviously it didn't work. And that was kind of the beginning of it. And I became, I had to start counting things. And so I became obsessive about counting
Sure.
calories and counting
Yeah.
macros. But the craziest part about the whole thing was, is I discovered how ass backwards, for lack of a better word, our healthcare system is. I was quite literally prescribed to eat little Debbie snacks, Otis Spunk Bar muffins to put weight on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and I even remember saying to my nutritionist and saying to my mom, like, I don't intend to eat this way once I'm healthy. Why am I eating this way now? And
Mm.
it turned me from, somewhat of like anorexic to a bulimirexic because I became so addicted to these highly palatable, processed foods that my eating disorder, I would say, became 10 times worse, to the point where like my nutritionist said, I can't serve you anymore. I think you need to go inpatient, which I did. Also, there, everything was tailored towards, putting weight on you and getting you out as quickly as possible, especially with
Hmm.
your insurance base. And they didn't really care about individualizing and customizing your program based on your specific needs, based on what was going on psychologically. And so again, it was like, eat as much food as you can, if you have 3 meals a day, if you're not gaining weight, they throw in shakes. If you don't want to eat something, if you don't like it or you're whatever, like they served greasy pizza one day. And it's like, if there were people who were just terrified to eat that, then you weren't allowed to exercise the next day. It was ridiculous. And I'm like, my struggle is not feeling full. How is this helping me? How is forcing me to overeat helping what I have going on? Right. And I checked myself out. Unfortunately, my mom was always kind of on my side and she understood the rationale and happily picked me up. Although everyone else in my family was like, she's enabling you. And, I was the one with the eating disorder, right? I knew it wasn't right and thought I could do it on my own. Eventually, I got into some trouble with the law. I was like stealing food and all kinds of things and realized I needed help again. And found a nutritionist who at the time was writing a book about how our food system is kind of perpetuating eating disorders and even
Sure.
creating them by all the chemicals and the way that they're manufacturing foods and being highly palatable and things like that. And she is really the one that got me over my fear of fat. Starting with coconut oil, I just started eating tablespoons of coconut oil throughout the day and just
Mm.
nourishing my brain. And as the inflammation in my brain went down and my body started getting what it needed, I realized I could eat certain things and I wouldn't gain weight. And, because ultimately that was the fear. I didn't want to be skinnier. I just didn't want
Yeah.
to weigh 200 pounds again. And she's the one that really helped me the most. And so that's kind of started me down the path of, at the time I was a biology major, like pre-med. I thought I wanted to go into gastroenterology because I'm like, well, that's kind of medical, but it also involves nutrition and this and that.
Yeah.
And then, after like dealing with my own psychological stuff relative to the eating disorder and like the mind body aspect, I'm like, well, maybe I should be a psychologist and do this and do that. And I discovered on a whim, I was like researching like some type of nutrition certification, something. And there was a doctor who was on the website and had like, 8 credentials at the end of his name. And one of them was ND or NMD. And I'm like, well, what is this? And I
Hmm.
researched it and discovered naturopathic medicine and, looked at the pillars and principles by which our medicine is founded, relative to, mind body medicine and treating the root cause and botanical medicine and physical medicine, just all the things that I really believed are preventative and really helping people. And I never looked back. There was only a few schools in the country at the time. I lived in Ohio and I chose the one in the warmest climate, which is here in Arizona. And that just kind of started my journey into, what I do now. Hormones obviously are, a natural progression of dealing with weight loss. And so I started a lot in the weight loss, space and the hormone space. And through that process, then really became fascinated with anti-aging and longevity. And then peptides naturally kind of came out of that too. So yeah,
Well,
it was very pain to purpose, but I was fortunate.
sure.
Like I'm very lucky that I found it. Otherwise I would be in a system that I didn't resonate with me and it was ethically just not in alignment with me.
Yeah. Well, you seem like the type of person though that's very driven and type of person that takes full ownership over the outcome of their life to the degree that it only seems fitting that you've found your way to where you are now, which is what I want to talk about. Obviously, in terms of your medical practice and who you serve, you said you're serving primarily men. It makes sense based on your backstory and kind of the relationship with your father and
Yeah.
building hard to kill parents, why that is the case. But what was it specifically about men that, and maybe your personality and men's personality, that makes it a good fit?
Yeah, it's interesting you ask that because I get asked that a lot, like, why men? Like, you're a
Yeah.
female, right? And it's an actually really interesting dynamic. There's something I think men, there's a lot of ego and there's a lot of competition within each other, right? And I find that men are willing to kind of let down their guard. They see me and they're like, oh, she's pretty, and then they're like, oh, she's really smart too. And they just feel comfortable in my presence. I've been told a number of times by, I mean, literally random strangers in grocery stores will stop me and say, like, I just want to tell you, you just have like the best energy. And I think that just being warm and inviting. And I'm just very non judgmental. I've been through a lot. I experienced a lot with my dad. Like there's nothing that a man or female will say to me where I'm going to be like, like
Hmm.
I'm very open minded. I get it. But yeah, that dynamic of like the male female like dichotomy, I think it's a beautiful synergy. Like I bring like a soft feminine nature to the visits, but I'm also kind of a guy's gal, I curse a little bit. Like I have kind of like a raunchy sense of humor, so like they're comfortable sharing things that they need to share with me, but like it doesn't feel awkward, I mean, we talk
Yeah.
about sexual health and all kinds of things. And it's, we can laugh about it, but also take it seriously. And they don't feel any sort of way because it's not like they're not sitting in front of a dude who like, maybe has it all together and has great erections and like, you know what I mean? It's actually just a beautiful synergy. Quite
Hmm.
the opposite with women. I find that the women I work best with are kind of like the women who are, you know, don't really like other women. Kind of just like that strong, like stubborn, kind of gals. I do
They're
find
more
there's a
like
lot.
men.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I find there's a lot of competition with men. Like when I first was working at the med spa that I was with for a few years, I remember I took over for a doctor who was, gosh, like 15 years older than me and didn't have any kids and just looked older. Like I have a very youthful, young presence, and she just was not. She was just like aged and just simple. And, I remember a patient walking in and she's like, the first thing she said to me was like, how old are you? Like, are you 16? And there was just a lot of skepticism, whereas like with the men, the beauty and the look doesn't take away from, what I have to offer, and validating my knowledge and my experience. With women, it's quite the opposite. There's a lot of competition, and
Yeah.
yeah, they're just intimidated, and they have no reason to be. The women that I work with love me, and we're cool, and it's also beautiful. Yeah,
Yeah, no, I get it completely. And I think, you're spot on with men. One of the hardest things for us, in my opinion, to do is to open up and talk about the things that are uncomfortable.
yeah,
Listen, this is the case in our relationships,
100%.
in our marriage, when it has to do with finances, to say nothing of what it has to do with hormones and sexual health and energy. And like these are deeply personal, uncomfortable topics
Yeah,
that we don't even talk to our buddies about,
right.
for the most part, let alone a random stranger, if you will, or even doctor. And so I can say, with certainty, especially with the alpha male nature of like, it's uncomfortable enough sharing this stuff, but then you get another dude who, is a doctor and you're sharing this stuff. But it would be one thing if they're like older and out of shape or something like the typical doctor. But
Yeah,
generally, the ones that are good are going to be
they
younger, going to
practice
be
what they
fit,
preach.
going to be extremely healthy.
Yeah,
They're going to be the male version of you. And it adds even more discomfort to share that type of stuff and potentially, degrade kind of your status. And I
hmm
think that's a really big thing with men. And so I can see why men would resonate with you. What are the things that men are typically coming to you for to get help with?
I mean, a lot of, like I said, all of my guys most of my patients are referral based. So they'll hear about me or they'll hear about testosterone therapy, and that kind of sparks their interest. And sometimes they're like, I just know like my buddy's on it and he like looks amazing and he feels great. And they don't always come to me with some like outward problem. Oftentimes they're like, I think I feel pretty good or whatever. And then as I start digging a little bit, the motivation, the lack of drive comes to play, comes out, and like well, yeah, I'm not feeling, like I used to. Like I want to get up and go to work and like do the things and even get to the gym is like that's hard. And, the effort I do put in at the gym, it's just not showing, and that's exhausting. And so those are the big ones. It's really the motivation piece. And there are guys that, outright know that about themselves. So like, yeah, I'm not feeling, like myself. And they don't always know that testosterone is the answer. But more and more men are realizing that drive is important and it should be there, and it's not. Every once in a while you'll have the sexual health function, but it's not as common as
Yeah,
as you would think.
sure.
Often testosterone, that's what guys think about. They're like, oh well, my erections are fine, so I must be fine. That can be a factor, can be a side effect, but it's not always the main player in the game.
Sure.
I would say weight gain and physical recovery, and the results they're getting at the gym are the biggest drivers.
Yeah, I think that there's much less of a stigma around testosterone replacement therapy and testosterone optimization nowadays, especially when you live in a bigger city like we live in Scottsdale, and
Yeah.
it's, you know,
So common.
it's very common. It's
Yeah.
very common, and that's a good thing in my opinion. But to the degree that, you know, if you're a guy and you're kind of wondering like, well, I know Joe, he looks great and he says he's feeling great and he's on TRT, and it's sort of like what I thought was taboo at one point now has me considering like, listen, I'm 40 or I'm in my late 30s or whatever. I'm getting older. And what was once chalked up as like quote unquote normal aging,
Yeah.
now sort of the level of knowledge and information out there is lending itself to this is not normal,
Right.
man. So the natural question becomes, well, geez, if I could feel better, that would be amazing. If I could look better, that would be amazing. Are the things that I'm doing, is there a way for me to, you know, despite the fact that I think I'm doing the right things, maybe there's something else at play that's contributing to me not getting the full benefit
Yeah.
of doing all the
Absolutely.
things that I think I should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you, I mean, hit the nail on the head with like societal norms. And it's great that we're kind of breaking through that. But yeah, it's, for a long time has left men feeling kind of just very hopeless and unmotivated to do anything because they feel like, well, this is just how it's supposed to be. I see it a lot more with women. I have to have that conversation with women, especially who are like perimenopause or in menopause, that there is a need for hormones, because we eventually stop making hormones. Whereas men, it slows down and it tapers off the production, but women will eventually have none, at least by way of estrogen and progesterone. And so they're even more apt to say, well, like, yeah, this is just how it is, and yeah, breaking that stigma and really educating on, the need and the benefit and how all age related illness is really directly correlated or inversely correlated with a decline in hormones. And if we can get
Yeah.
hormone function optimal, everything else goes down. Heart disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, osteoporosis, those things are a byproduct of having suboptimal hormones.
You know, one of the big questions that I have conversations with clients about that I think a lot of guys are confused about or concerned about is sort of like, when I go down the road of testosterone therapy, I guess my question is going to be, when is it relevant
Yeah.
versus, I think the big kind of chicken and egg conversation is like, when is it relevant
Yeah.
versus nutrition and lifestyle and exercise implementation? How do you make that determination?
Yeah. I mean, it's an analysis of labs and intake and lifestyle. What are they doing? And then where do their labs come in with everything that they're either doing or not doing? I would imagine, the clients that you see, they probably will elevate their testosterone, if it, even if it's not low, there's a really good chance that they're boosting their testosterone by 100 points, 200 points after they've been with you for a period of time. And so then it becomes, where did they start out? Optimal 900 to 1100 is really what we shoot for when we're doing therapy. Someone who's not,
And real quick,
yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want
no,
to
you're
make
good.
it very clear that normal levels are what, 250 to
Oh my gosh.
900 on
So
labs.
yeah, depending on the lab company, the normal reference range goes anywhere from a 250 to 300 to some as low as 700, 750, I believe. And I don't use LabCorp's Northwest a lot, but I think one of them does go up to 1100, which is really promising. But the sad part is you could be as low as 300 and still be
And
normal.
still be
Meanwhile,
normal.
1100 is as a game player.
And so
So
for, I just think this is really important for guys listening, and is, one is what we just touched on, is like, just because your labs are normal, like just because your total testosterone is normal, first and foremost, that's just one marker, by the way, and not necessarily even the most important marker in the grand scheme of things.
correct.
So, you know, even if your total testosterone is normal or low normal, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean anything
Yeah,
if you're symptomatic,
exactly.
right?
Yeah. So
And then, sorry,
comparing
go ahead.
yeah, comparing symptoms is really key too, because I was going to say, like, I have some men that will come in naturally at 850, and they feel really good, and then I'll have someone come in at 700 and they're like symptomatic across the board, right?
Right.
So then it's a matter of meeting somewhere where they're at and not being so rigid with the reference ranges, because some men feel optimal at 1400, and if their body's metabolizing it, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I had a guy who messaged me on Instagram yesterday because I made a post on, you know, how like 40% of guys over 45 have technically low testosterone. It's probably even more than that. But that's where, we have to look at free testosterone and sex hormone binding globulin. And I'll actually put a link. I have a blood work guide
Oh, nice.
that I'll post,
Yeah.
that I'll drop in the show notes here for you guys, that you can download, free download, to check that out, because I don't want to go too far into the weeds with that. But it's so important, because I'm observing, and this is why I like to have conversations with people like you, because guys are being gaslit around testosterone in the
Yeah.
conventional medical world. I've had numerous guys message me, and
Yeah.
friends whom have shared blood work with me, and I've expressed some concern that they need to talk to their physician about having both low total and low free,
Mhm.
which point they've gotten backlash and either been fired as a client just for questioning, that stuff. It's really ridiculous. And I don't know, I'm assuming that's probably something that you've experienced
I
as well.
have, yeah. Especially, you mentioned like the age, like that, age 40, 45, which used to be kind of the norm of when we see levels taper off. I'm now seeing men in my practice who are, mid 20s, who actually have half the levels of what 40-year-olds typically come in with. And I can guess almost by looking at someone their age what they're coming in with. And
Mm.
it's really scary. I mean, the number of guys who are in their 20s who are at a 200 or 300. And oftentimes in those cases, their PCP won't even run the labs. Like they will say, I'm not running those. You don't need it at your age, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, and that begs, it begs where, if symptoms are present, then you've got to dive further down the rabbit hole. And what I'll encourage is just being proactive about this process and being open to seeing someone else,
Yep.
and changing medical practices. And what I'll strongly encourage also is just the mindset shift that you might have to, in regards to being proactive, you likely going to have to pay out of pocket.
Yes. That's a big, that's, yeah. I mean, that's almost a given, even with men's clinics, that a lot of them are out of pocket, but insurance, I mean, I personally like, I could actually send testosterone prescriptions to a regular pharmacy. I don't like doing it because the product is crap. It's in cottonseed oil and I'm just not about that. So I always use compounding pharmacies. But yeah, I mean, going through a practitioner that is running everything through insurance, including the office visits and all of that, you're not going to get the level of care and the optimization because they are confined by reference ranges, and oftentimes even the way that they dose and prescribe is just not, it's not modern. They're one shot every 1 to 2 weeks versus microdosing every day or every other day to get best results, and then you're dealing with polypharmacy and having to take estrogen blockers and DHT blockers and all kinds of
Yep.
things. So you just don't get the same level of care, and it's an experience thing too. They're just not practicing and doing it the way, on a regular basis. I mean, they have like one class in hormones and
Well,
urology
that's
or
it. And
anything.
in all fairness to, providers and physicians, is it's just something that they haven't had the
Yeah.
experience and developed the skill set around or knowledge around, and they're
Yeah.
not teaching that stuff, and they don't have time to go off and learn it on their own.
No.
And so, again, I can't sympathize with the backlash and with gaslighting and treating clients like shit for questioning their medical practices. But what I can sort of acknowledge is they just don't know any
Yeah.
better. And so they're stuck in this sort of the conventional wisdom around dosing every week or once every two
Yeah.
weeks and using estrogen blockers and, like you said, all of that stuff. And so obviously, you being exclusively around who you work with and what you do are pretty attuned to sort of best practices now. And frankly, like, that's what we need. That's what guys need now. And, comes back to really being proactive about this process of actually doing your diligence and learning how to interpret and understand your blood work to some degree, of like, what are the big things that we're looking for?
Right.
What are actual optimal ranges? Working with a physician like you who can help dial this stuff in. What do you think is kind of the most important factor for guys to consider when going down the road of testosterone optimization? Because I know that sort of one of the big concerns is just the fact that they're going to be on it for life.
Yeah.
How do we put that into perspective?
Yeah, and that is a big question. A lot of people are like, I don't want to be on something. Men and women, I don't want to be on something for the rest of my life. And one, it's not like Prozac. We're giving the body something natural that's bioidentical and replacing what it's not making any longer. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that you're not making enough now. And you're not going to make more as you get older. So it's a matter of the quality of life that you want to have. And yeah, I mean, it's really that. Do you want to live a long, healthy life and feel amazing? The way that we tailor therapy when you're 45 versus when you're 70 may be different. Energy demands and output are going to be different. And so the levels we need to keep you at may change. But ultimately, there's so much benefit to having your androgen receptors stimulated. I mean, we have androgen receptors on literally every organ and tissue in our body. And so it's helping with brain and muscle mass and bone density. Yeah. And then all of the chronic illnesses that we talked about, with Alzheimer's, dementia, all of that, there is a need and nothing will replace that. Those receptors aren't bound with testosterone. So it's a quality of life thing. And, I always say, give it a shot. If you don't like it, we can take you off of it and, do a post-cycle therapy kind of thing. But for most men, they will choose to stay on it because of how they feel.
Yeah.
And that's just it. They if they go off of it, they're like, this just isn't worth it. And it's a choice that they make to stay on it.
Yeah, I agree. And, it's definitely one of those decisions. I mean, it's like we have to put things in perspective here is the time that we're living in, we are exposed to more good and bad things than humans have ever been exposed to in human existence. And all of this has compounded so exponentially over the past 100 years
Yeah.
to the degree that physiologically we are just not equipped to handle
No.
the amount of exposure chemically,
Yeah.
environmentally, physiologically from a stress perspective is we really do need to go out of our way to do everything that we possibly can. And what I'll say is with the advancement of modern medicine and, now the role of peptides and the way that things are moving and how quickly they're moving in the scope of medical advancement and in therapeutics, it's almost like ChatGPT. It's like AI. I mean, it's almost like at this point, how can you justify not using AI
Right.
to your benefit?
Right.
You know, you can get by without it, but why?
Right. Yeah.
And I realized because it took me a long time to get on board, despite having really low levels for a long time. And now it's been, 7 or 8 months and which, in the scope of things is not that long, but it's definitely made a
Well, when you're
stark
in the field that
improvement.
you're in, with fitness and nutrition, there can be a little bit of, you feel like you're cheating, you're not being
Well,
authentic if you're
100%.
doing it right. And the important thing to note is that, you get the best results when you're doing what you're doing, and so it makes a really beautiful, complete picture to have the nutrition and diet in place and to be working out and actually utilizing what you're putting in your body. You're not cheating the system. It's really about optimization.
Frankly, it took me a long time to do that
Yeah.
because of the perception is like, oh, well, now you're lean because you're on
Right.
TRT. It's like, dude, I was lean. I was
Yeah.
leaner before.
Right.
I was leaner before I was on TRT. Now, just with life and stress and everything like that. Yeah, sure, I feel a little bit better, but I'm not as lean as I was. And yeah, I'm sleeping a little bit better, recovering better.
Yeah.
And so all of those benefits, to say nothing of long term health. But yeah, that level of imposter syndrome and all of that kind of stuff. But now with the guys that I really work with, I'm perfectly comfortable acknowledging it's like, to be equipped with this level of knowledge and personal experience just makes me a better coach. And
100%.
understanding that the vast majority of guys in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, to some degree, if they truly want to optimize, need to go down this road, then I also want to be equipped to be able to help them navigate it,
Yeah.
right? And co-pilot them
And you
down
want
it.
them to
And
be
so,
successful. And ultimately it could come in between, what they're doing with you and the results that you expect to see. It's an integral part of body composition. And like I mentioned, the input and output of exercise and the results that you're getting. And, don't want them writing you off, like, because your program doesn't work. No, there's can be other factors at play, and that is foundational. So
well, it's like you said, you do need to be implementing. And as I always talk about, it's like we have to have the nutrition, the lifestyle, and the training components in place. And so that's why I brought up kind of the chicken and the egg
yeah.
scenario. But listen, if levels are legitimately low, then, it might be going down the road of testosterone optimization therapy. And then that's going to just compound your results with your training
Yeah.
and, body composition results and energy. It's just this feed forward cycle,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So let's talk peptides.
Yeah.
Peptides are sort of buzzword
Yep.
now, like we're hearing more and more. There's so many benefits. Obviously, we have the GLP-1 based
Yeah.
medical interventions, which are fantastic and fantastically confusing.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
maybe let's start there.
Yeah.
Talk about just peptides in general. Like, what should people be thinking about when they hear the word peptides? Like, what are we thinking about in terms of health optimization?
Yeah. So peptides are kind of like the cherry on top, I say. There are a lot of practitioners who will just willy nilly prescribe peptides. Someone comes in and they've got fatigue or joint pain or whatever. Sure, there are peptides that will help with that, but it's not a root cause treatment, right? Like you're really just masking symptoms. And oftentimes there is something hormonally or maybe there's
Hmm.
toxic burden. So that's something to keep in mind. Peptides will get you results, but they're not necessarily treating a root cause. That being said, they are kind of like keys for locks. You only certain keys will only unlock certain doors, and that's how they behave in the body. So they are signaling molecules that will turn on and off processes. Basically, they're amino acids. So from like a
Yeah.
chemistry perspective, they're amino acid chains. They're like small fragments of highly complex folded proteins, and we are made of proteins, right? So yeah, they can be used to stimulate, production of like say growth hormone or ligament tissue or bone tissue or inducing insulin and glucagon like the GLPs. And so yeah, they're great tools, but they shouldn't negate the need for a deeper comprehensive approach to health and whatnot. Lots of uses. I think, like you said, the GLPs I think they really popularized peptides. I mean, peptides have been around for a while in the way that we know them. Insulin-based therapy is, the
Right.
oldest peptide, and it's been around for over 100 years. But really with the GLPs, I think it really started opening people's eyes and to the world of peptides. And, there's BPC. That's a really, really common one. BPC 157, tendons and ligaments and joint pain. The growth hormone secreting peptides
Yep.
like CJC, ipamorelin, sermorelin.
Sermorelin, tesamorelin.
Yeah, so those are really popular.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's awesome. And so I like how you said the icing on the cake because I think
Yeah.
that's an important component. It's like, dude, if we're not focusing on, we talked about TRT and, we talked about like, listen, the nutrition, lifestyle, training, foundational
Mhm.
components of getting those dialed in, regardless of whether or not you're on TRT. TRT is just going to help improve everything and vice versa
Yeah.
there in terms of recovery and energy and all the androgen receptors throughout the body. And so that would be sort of closer to the bottom and the foundation of the pyramid. And then as we're working our way up, that's where we can take the peptides into consideration, albeit obviously with the GLPs, that can be a good impetus for
Sure.
someone to jumpstart maybe their
Yes.
journey into controlling for their nutrition and their training
Yes.
and getting some of the weight off. How do you view the GLP-1 based peptides in your practice
Yeah.
and what you've seen to date?
I love them. I've been prescribing them for, gosh, probably close to 5 years since they really became available through the compounding world. And they are great tools, having had an eating disorder and having, knowing what it's like. I mean, I still struggle with like the obsessive compulsive food noise, and that addictive nature. They're great tools for helping being a catalyst for lifestyle changes, when dosed appropriately. There again are a lot of doctors who willy-nilly prescribe these products, and you can get Ozempic through telehealth and a provider that does no consult with you, doesn't provide any guidance. And I think that's careless, and it leads to suboptimal results and all of these negative critiques that you hear of the body composition and muscle loss and weight falling off in a way that is not healthy or attractive, stomach paralysis, all of these
Do
things.
you think that those are accurate?
If you're not doing the right things when on the peptides, absolutely, yes. So like for me and a lot of my colleagues, protein forward, like you must be eating a lot of protein. In general, I tell patients a gram of protein per pound of desired body weight, whether you want to gain weight, maintain weight, or lose, like that's what we're aiming for. And it's no exception with GLPs. The hard thing with GLPs is that they're slowing digestion and they're reducing your appetite. So eating
Correct.
a satiating, hard to digest macro becomes even more difficult. So it's really important. I stress you must eat protein breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Skipping meals. If you skip meals, you're going to lose weight very quickly, and it's going to come off in the way of muscle. Your body is going to start breaking down. There will be a catabolic process. And it's very easy to not eat all day, And so if a doctor has not told you, and kind of deal breaker, like you have to be eating this, you're going to get results that aren't favorable. And
Well, I
then
think it,
then you're like, well, then you write off the medications as being, well, there's not safe, and that's not true.
yeah. And to be fair, I think even if the doctor has told you, it still becomes, in my experience in speaking with, plenty of clients about this, it becomes like you said, with the food noise and sort of the situation where you're like, all of the sudden, I'm just not hungry.
Yeah,
And despite the fact that I know better, it becomes way too easy to just get lost
yeah,
in the shuffle of life and
yep,
business and to find yourself like, I just haven't eaten all day long. And so it begs this sort of level of skill development that we talk a lot about in our coaching practice around planning and preparation, to the degree that if you're going to take the responsibility to go on these, weight loss medications, then you also have to take the responsibility of doing the things that you need to do in
yes,
terms of a plan, just like you would if you were on any other
right,
weight loss plan,
right.
you know,
Yeah, meal
of
prepping,
committing
setting
to.
timers in your phone, like you have to be accountable.
That's
Yeah,
right. There's too much lip service, in my opinion, to like, yeah, but you still need to eat it's like going to the doctor and they're like, just, eat less and exercise more.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But like, that doesn't mean anything.
Right. Yeah. No, the schedule and the regimen, the routine is really important. The whole stomach paralysis thing. I've never had a patient in my practice who struggled with that. That being said, I can see how it would happen if you go all day without eating and your digestion is also slowed. The body is going to forget how to digest food. The only cure for actual gastroparesis is eating small, frequent meals throughout the day to tell your stomach that it needs to digest.
Do
So
you,
yeah.
do you subscribe to microdosing?
It depends on the patient. Some patients do really well with it. I would say men are more apt to be responsive to microdosing just by way of metabolic nature, and men just being a little bit more, they lose weight easier.
Yeah.
That's just it. That being said, I do have a few men that are very metabolically stubborn. My husband is one of those. Like, we tried microdosing Retatrutide. It worked for about 2 weeks and then he plateaued. So now he does bigger doses, and it's not even every week, but so it really depends on the patient. I've had some women that do well with microdosing. Yeah, it's very individualized in my book. I will try it, for someone, and if it doesn't work, I will absolutely switch them because we want them getting results. We want it to be effective.
What are you seeing with Retatrutide versus the Semaglutide and
Yeah.
Tirzepatide?
It's amazing. So it has all of the benefits of semaglutide and tirzepatide. So like the food noise, appetite
Plus,
suppression,
plus now
yeah,
glucagon.
plus fat oxidation. There's because you're oxidizing fat, you have an increase in energy. And I wouldn't say you're not like bouncing off the walls, but semaglutide for sure will cause, fatigue, like lack of endurance throughout the day. Like you're ready to go to bed. You just
Well,
feel
all that's
run
doing,
down.
as far as I understand, is basically just the gut, just slowing down
Yeah.
digestion.
Yeah. And there is some interplay with dopamine, in the brain too. So there's just kind of like a meh feeling like, yeah, I don't want to eat, but I don't want to
Oh,
do
sure.
anything else
Yeah.
either. So with Retta, I think the increase in energy is really just offsetting the energy loss in the other two. Like I said, people aren't like bouncing off the walls and, doing cartwheels down the hallway, but they don't feel run down. There is more muscle retention, more fat loss, and the nausea and the GI upset is typically not there. There's always exceptions, to the rule. I have two patients now who both need to do smaller doses of the Retta because they do feel a little bit nauseous, but nothing compared to what they felt like on the semaglutide or tirzepatide, where they were throwing up or having to go to the hospital. Not under my care. This is someone else, but
Yeah, sure.
yeah, people can have very serious side effects depending on the individual and what else is going on. And that's also where a comprehensive approach, and, I don't run labs on everyone who's just doing a GLP, but if there is something like that going on, like getting a look at liver function and kidney function, gallbladder function, like what actually, is there something else that needs to be addressed? Is there stagnation and our drainage pathway issues that we need to look at for this particular patient to make the therapy effective?
When would you have someone consider a GLP?
Yeah, interesting. A lot of times it's like if they're doing everything and they're just not getting the results to move the needle. It's more common, I would say, in women, especially in that like perimenopause, menopause phase. There are some women that respond really well to hormone therapy, and that's what moves the needle in their weight and their body composition. And there are some women that just have a form of inflammatory fat that has deposited because of hormonal changes and fluctuations that requires a little bit of assistance. And so it's looking at that whole picture, what are they doing? is that dialed in as best as it can be? And
And so, and just for clarity, so this goes, when we say doing everything right, we're considering, okay, they're strength training, they're moving, they're getting enough movement throughout the week, and they're eating in some semblance of a calorie deficit,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And we're just not seeing things budge.
yes.
And so there's some level of metabolic derangement to the degree that, physics isn't physicking, if
Right.
you will.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot. I mean, again, you could spend thousands and thousands of dollars. I do have patients who, will run organic acid tests and we'll look at mitochondrial function. We'll look at all of those things. So that's not feasible for everyone. And it's also a long, lengthy process, to go through that if you really want to look at what's driving this metabolic stagnation. We'll get there at some point, but it's a matter of some people just need results to feel confident and feel to like take that next step, and keep doing what they're doing because you get exhausted. If you put in work every day and you don't get
100%.
results, it's you're like, why am I doing this?
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, I couldn't possibly agree with you more. And that's one of the most frustrating things as a coach, obviously, is like, listen, on paper, like you're doing the right things. And the only thing that I can say is we just have to continue to kind of crank because like what's the alternative? You're not going to go back to
right.
eating like shit
You're
and
still
not
better off doing what
exercising.
you're doing. It's just
Yeah,
not,
exactly. It's still better
like
off, but
yeah.
it's sort of this just not fair kind of
Right. I
mentality.
was
It's
gonna
like,
say, like
listen,
for the
and
guy next
right,
to you
but
who like loses, 5 pounds a week and is like ripped, and then you're yeah.
yeah, that's a whole, complexity in and of itself. Real quick though, when would you consider, because I do have a couple clients where this is something I'm thinking about, but it's like, when might it be appropriate to switch someone from tirzepatide to a retatrutide? Would it be, and is that something that you do, especially during periods of stagnation?
I've interchanged all of them, depending on the person, what they're experiencing. Semaglutide, I would say, is probably one of it's not the most potent, but it has really strong side effects, which lends itself to really good results in the sense that like people just aren't hungry, and they're for a lot of people they have food aversions. So you're like looking at food and you want to throw up, and it's
Yeah,
some people need that. They need that negative reinforcement.
yeah,
For other people, both men and women, they're like, ugh. And I find men are more sensitive to the side effects. I don't know if that's if they're just you just don't tolerate feeling sick as well as women.
that's
You
probably
know,
fair.
yeah, just like when you have the flu and whatever. But
Yeah.
yeah, if the side effects become too unbearable, or you're just tired of feeling a certain way, that's a great time to try something else. And retatrutide is relatively new versus the other two. So even if someone's not having serious side effects, or they're over whatever they're doing and just tired of it, I will still offer it. It's like say like, hey, this is a great product. It doesn't have whatever because the lifting piece, resistance training is so important. But then there's also the fatigue and the like just the mental and physical fatigue that come with semaglutide and tirzepatide. I will offer it just because it allows people to get to the gym and actually do the things that they need to be doing to get the best results if they're plateauing. And that does happen. Like there are max doses for a lot of these products, so if we've reached a point where, they're doing everything and they've just we're not seeing anything, the needle move relative to weight composition, we'll try something else. And sometimes it's just giving the body a shift, like shifting. I have a
Yeah.
patient that we switch back and forth between tirzepatide and retatrutide every few weeks just to jolt the system. Again, a
I,
metabolically stubborn patient who just the body just needs a change.
I think that's, I teach a muscle physiology class at ASU, and yesterday we were talking about just this level of metabolic flexibility, because every piece of evidence and research shows that the body functions a certain way, and it's sort of generally accepted. Like with our energy systems, right? We burn the most amount of fat, up to about 65% of our VO2 max, at which point we switch more into carbohydrate. But the reality is actually, like, especially people who are metabolically deranged, do not do that.
Yeah.
They rely so much more on carbohydrate
Yeah.
at lower levels of intensity. And the point of that is exactly what you're saying around just switching up, because I think fundamentally humans and our biochemistry is built to go through these levels of metabolic flexibility, whether it's
Yes.
feast or famine, or more carbs or more fat, or more, more protein.
Yes.
And we function best when we do have those adaptations and the changes in stimulus,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. It's just with anything, just like exercise. Like if you do the same workout
Right.
every day for the rest of your life, your body it's just going to become routine and you're not going to see changes. You're going to stay exactly where you're at. So yeah, it's flexibility in all ways.
You mentioned some of the other peptides. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now. We'll have you back on to talk maybe a
Sure.
little bit more about that, but just really the fact that those are signaling molecules, they're icing on the cake to kind of facilitate. And that's where, when we talk about the metabolism, that can be good to kind of throw those signals into the system to drive more fat loss, improve joint health, brain function, support the immune system, right? On top of everything else that we're doing. But more functionally, from a just overall wellness standpoint, a lot of the guys, like, what do you think the guys that come in to see you need to hear, the guys that are listening to this podcast and, they're not feeling as good as they need to feel, they're overly stressed out at work, they're trying to eat healthy, but having a hard time with their schedule and responsibilities with their family and their business, and sort of guys like me, guys that like the guys that I work with, there's a lot seemingly on our plate and we deal with a lot, and I think that can feel overwhelming to the degree that adding in all of this other stuff that we're talking about can just feel like an overflowing plate.
Sure.
What would you say, and what do you say to clients like that to kind of help paint the picture of what this process could look like?
Yeah. I mean, the overwhelm and stress is something I bring up almost every initial consultation, like strategy call, because when stress and overwhelm is one of the biggest driving factors for low hormone function. When the body is stressed, that's one of the first things it begins to shut down is testosterone production in both men and women and just hormones across the board. When we don't have optimal testosterone, we are less capable of dealing with stress. So it feels more overwhelming. It feels insurmountable. And so it becomes a vicious cycle. And so what I would say is, yeah, it might feel overwhelming to add in a therapy, but ultimately you're going to get to a point where that overwhelm is manageable.
Mm,
Because you have the means there to deal with it and you're able to compartmentalize. And so this will become a tool in helping you deal with your stress. We all have stress. It's just a matter, and perception of stress is a
perception.
big
Yeah.
aspect of that. And yeah, when testosterone is low, that perception is much greater. And yeah, and that's what leads to burnout.
What are the other lifestyle factors that we need to take into consideration in the big picture here?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the basic stuff that I'm sure listeners and followers have all heard, but getting off devices and getting sunlight, like first thing in the morning, we need sunlight and to set a circadian rhythm and, to signal our body, proper sleep and wake cycles. It boosts dopamine, it boosts testosterone. Being on devices, being in front of, phones,
Yeah.
computers, television, whatever. I mean, it's that constant dopamine drip that then depletes our body. There's a direct correlation between dopamine and testosterone. They interplay. And so it will start to run your system down. But then it's the blue light exposure that also impacts that production. And then it starts affecting other hormone levels like insulin and cortisol. And again, those all start to affect natural testosterone production. Just you mentioned movement, like constant movement. We are nomadic beings. We are not so evolved from cavemen, 1,000 years ago that we don't still need that. And being so sedentary and not using large muscle groups and not you doing compound movements of like picking up rocks and having to chop wood and doing all these things, like we need that. Men especially need that. Chopping wood is like the best exercise for boosting testosterone from an aggression standpoint. Like it releases endorphins and boosts dopamine, and then you're using a lot of muscle groups. But it's not surprising, it's like a super manly activity. And like getting back to that, men were not meant to sit, in fluorescent lighting, sedentary in a chair all day.
Yeah.
And then diet is a big part of that as well. Getting whole foods that fuel testosterone production, animal based like fats and cholesterol. I think we're starting to break through that stigma of like cholesterol being bad, but it's so important, to eat the whole egg, not just the egg whites, to have grass fed beef, to have salmon, to have these rich sources of nutrients and fat to actually fuel that production. And then there are things that, we can try to avoid, but are still trickling into to our environment and into our system. And those are, like you mentioned, toxins, environmental chemicals and things like that. Plastics and forever chemicals, they're pervasive. And I really think that's what's driving the lower testosterone we're seeing in young guys, because they've only grown up in this highly toxic world versus
Yeah.
you or your parents or grandparents who,
Yeah.
it just wasn't as pervasive. And so being super mindful about like not drinking from plastic water bottles and, home filtration systems and, then adding electrolytes and minerals back into your water and not putting cologne and lotions and all these scented, just chemical shitstorms all over our bodies, not wearing polyester plastic clothing, especially if you're sweating in it, because that's being directly absorbed into your tissues, especially if you're wearing underwear, gym shorts, whatever. That's going right into the testicles and affecting, production that, is going on down there by way of testosterone and sperm counts. So there's a lot of that, environmental, piece that, you can actively, we really need to be making conscious effort because it is pervasive. So, if you're not doing anything to mitigate that exposure, you don't stand a chance.
I couldn't possibly agree more. That was very well said. And something I've talked about quite a lot on the show, especially it's been a while though. And I'm really glad you brought it up because dude, I've talked about this stuff for years. And it's been a minute, but it's so relevant, so much more now so than ever before, to say nothing of like we have all the environmental stuff and now we have all of the, the screens, and it's sort of this a constant exposure.
Yeah.
And it really obviously makes a really big difference. Dr. Jess, it's really a pleasure having the opportunity to speak with you and for you to share your wisdom and knowledge. Where can people find out more about you?
Yeah. So you can go to my website. It's ruggedgent.life. There's links for strategy calls if you want to, have a meeting with me. It's free. Instagram, doctor spelled out. So Dr_Jess_NMD. I'm sure you'll have it in show notes.
I will.
So yeah, Instagram, and it's probably the best way to find me. Website's actually there's still things I need to develop on that. I'm a one-woman show. So
Yep. I feel you.
that's my newest website that I really love, and that's where I direct people, but there's still some things that need to be worked on there. But there's a decent amount of information, and either way you'll get to me. I am the only person behind the business, so I'm the face
Great.
of everything. And yeah,
We'll have you on again. I want to talk more
love to.
about your family life, how you hold the fort down as a solopreneur, and just kind of the appreciation I have for someone who's, built a good business, but also makes time for their family and has been able to find the balance. I think that in and of itself is such a fundamental tool and kind of skill to develop. And then you're here in Scottsdale, Phoenix area. I know we have a lot of listeners in the area, so don't hesitate. It could be where you can see Dr. Jess in person. And I
In
know you
person
have a
or virtual.
virtual.
I'm about
Yep.
80% virtual, so no pressure to come in. It makes it a lot easier for everyone to do virtual consults. So
Amazing. And I'm also here, so let's get a lift or a hike and or
100%.
coffee and get together soon. Appreciate you so much. Thank you.
Likewise. Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you for having me.